welcome to the podcast. Today I had the privilege of sitting down with Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen. He is someone that has spent years living together and speaking with his Palestinian neighbors. And he's got a bold proposal as to how to finally solve the current conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. You may not agree with everything. I questioned him and I continue to question his approach, but this is something really, really worth listening to because we all know that the status quo ain't working. So let's get to it. Here's my conversation with Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen. Okay, welcome to the Wildscast. I am joined by Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen, who is a thought leader in Israel, advocating a very, very important message that I thought was significant for our listeners on the Wildcast. Welcome, Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen. It's an honor and a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. The honor is mine. Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little, let's get right to it. What are your goals? What are your goals and aspirations? I know you're part of this vision movement, and I know that you have conducted lots of conversations with your Palestinian neighbors. You live in an area which is largely Arab and Jewish, and you've made some headway with your neighbors. But
Sure.
What are the goals and aspirations of the participants in this current chapter of Jewish history that you are trying to lead?
So I want to be very clear that, and honest up front, that everything that I'm doing, and I think most of us in the Vision Movement are doing, is really being driven by a sense of actively participating in Jewish history, of being characters in Israel's story, in this unique chapter of Israel's story, which I personally see as one of the most amazing and climactic chapters of our story. And we're really coming into this in the wake of the successes of the Zionist movement, right? The Zionist movement was incredibly successful at bringing a broken and scattered people back to life in their ancient land with their ancient language. And but I think Zionism as a unique stage of Jewish liberation has ended, and the next generation needs a new Jewish liberation movement that can come in the wake of Zionism. So in order to be able to advance us forward, to be able to advance our aspirations forward, our story forward. And at the Vision Movement, we run a lot of programs. Some of them are in person, many are online. Anybody wants to check them out can go to visionmovement.org. And these programs are really geared towards training university students and young professionals to really formulate their own positions and ideological tendencies, their own unique Jewish liberation movement relevant to this chapter of Jewish history, to figure out what are the objectives of Jewish history now after the successes of Zionism. In fact, how can we use the conditions created by Zionism's success to be able to go and achieve some of the next aspirations of our prophets and sages. So some of us have come to the conclusion, that we leave a lot of space for people to come to their own conclusions because, just like Zionism had multiple ideological tendencies, and I think the friction between those rival Zionist tendencies actually propelled us forward a century ago. So to today, in a post-Zionist world, I think that, empowering many young Jews to really formulate their own Jewish liberation movement, I think will lead to a situation we have many different ideological tendencies in competition with each other and pushing each other forward as a result. So for my own conclusions, one of them is reconciliation with the Palestinians. I do see that as an objective of Jewish history right now. I'm somebody who spent a lot of my adult life trying to fight against a two-state solution, whether it's building new Jewish communities on various mountaintops in the West Bank, in the Samaria and Judea regions, whether it's building new Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. But I realized at a certain point a few things. Number one, that the Palestinian story is a real story that we have to deal with. And I think Hashem put them in our land on purpose. I think that there are people we need to relate to, not just as an unwanted enemy population, but maybe there's something else going on there that the Kadosh Baruch Hu wants of us that we need to really struggle with and figure out. Number one. And number two, that if we really want to absolutely destroy the two-state solution, if we want to make partition completely impossible logistically. It's not enough to just populate, as many mountains as we can in the West Bank. We also have to find ways to ally with our Palestinian neighbors. And I actually think just one of the things I found through about 13 years of doing this work is that the contradictions between the Jews living in Judea and Samaria and our Palestinian neighbors are actually much less than the contradictions between Palestinians and what we can call Zionist Tel Aviv, meaning that we actually have more in common culturally, and in terms of values. And I think that what we need to feel like winners in the story we're living in it conflicts less with what Palestinians need to feel like winners in the story they're living in.
And so tell us, let's get into it a little. Explain what a one state, because when people hear one state solution, the last thing they think of is Palestinian reconciliation, which is what you started saying. You said we have to stop looking at the Palestinians as some sort of problem, and that they maybe were, destined, if you will, to be here, and we need to figure something out. But then you go into the one state solution. Like, what does that look like? What does a one state solution, and how can a one state solution accommodate the Palestinians, the desire and the will of the Palestinian people?
Right. So, first of all, when we started doing this work, this reconciliation work, about 13 years ago, we were often referred to as alternative peace activists. And I'm not really sure I like that term, but and people use it less these days. But I think the reason they used it at the time was three reasons. Number one, the fact that we're against the two-state solution and are not interested in involving the international community or, European governments, Christian evangelicals, any outsiders in the work that we do. We're interested in only really empowering Jews and Palestinians, including diaspora Jews and diaspora Palestinians.
Between the two parties, directly between the two parties.
Right. So that was one reason we're alternative, because usually when people speak about the peace industry or peace organizations in Israel, they're talking about European-funded NGOs that are pushing a two-state solution. So we're not that, obviously. The second reason we're considered alternative is because we don't claim that peace could be achieved by bringing the quote-unquote moderates together, like the westernized diplomats from Tel Aviv and Ramallah, to sign an American piece of paper. We believe that the only way to really achieve any kind of peace is to bring the quote-unquote extremists together, those who are really living their people's stories on a deep level, those who are willing to fight, kill, and die for what we believe to be important to our national stories, what we believe to be important to our people. We need to be the peacemakers. These are the Jews and Palestinians that need to be empowered to lead when it comes to peace. And the third reason we're considered alternative is because we don't believe that peace could ever be achieved by forcing either side to compromise on anything that's fundamentally important to us. The only way we could actually achieve what I would call peace or reconciliation would be where both sides, for the most part, or at least those who are fully living their side's story and aspirations, feel like winners in the story they're living in. So for us to do that, we have to really break down the core aspirations and grievances of both sides and the narratives we live in. And when I say narrative, I want to be very clear. When I say narrative, I mean a collection of facts that are selectively chosen, organized to tell a certain kind of story, and contextualized within an ideological worldview. So I think when it comes to our conflict with the Palestinians, over, I guess now we could say 102 years, there are millions of facts. And what we see is both sides really selecting the facts that support the story we want to tell and kind of omitting or ignoring the facts that complicate that story. So I think we're both telling the truth about ourselves.
Right. So
but getting it wrong about the other.
Yeah, no, I think that's very accurate. And that's what happens when two people are fighting each other. They, it's not like lying, but they choose although I do feel that there has been some lying going on as well. But just to summarize, you're considered an alternative peace activist because you're against third parties like the European Union or the United States. And I'm in complete agreement with that. You want a plan that's going to allow not just for the moderates, but even the extremists to work together. And number three, you don't want there to be a situation where either side has to compromise on their fundamental values. Tell us how the one state solution accomplishes this.
So I would say that right now, Israel, the Jewish character of Israel, Israel essentially functions as a European-style nation state with Jewish decorations. Those Jewish decorations are way too Jewish for Palestinians and not Jewish enough for Haredim. And Haredim are important, by the way, because Haredim are the fastest growing population between the river and the sea. I'd say second place is a tie between Jews like me, the national religious, and Palestinians. So the country's changing. Also, when we speak about peace and different plans and processes, we have to think about the socio-political trajectory of the country, not just where it is right now.
Right. Now, by the way, Haredim, for those of you listening, maybe unfamiliar, are what I guess loosely defined as ultra-Orthodox Jews. Okay, continue, please, Rabbi.
Yeah. So, so I would say that, when a nation achieves its independence, especially a nation that's been oppressed and ruled by others for an extended period of time, they really need to enter what we call a post-colonial process. They need to have a post-colonial conversation. And Israel, I'd say, Kol v'chomer, for those who know what a Kol v'chomer is, Israel even more so would need this, because we weren't just conquered and colonized in our own land. We were really, especially Ashkenazi Jews, we were thrown into the belly of the beast, and we were thrown into the civilization that had destroyed us and spent roughly 2,000 years being systematically oppressed in cycles by that civilization in various ways and places. So we are an extremely colonized people, and when we finally achieved our freedom in 1948, our material freedom, our material independence, we had no interest in engaging in this post-colonial conversation. And I think that was a mistake. I think we're still suffering from that. I think Palestinians are suffering from that, arguably even more, because they're kind of living under it. And I think that one of the things we need to do is have this post-colonial conversation, really talk about what it means. First of all, talk about what happened to us so we can heal, because a lot happened to us. And so much of our identity and so much of our worldview has been influenced by the trauma of 2,000 years of exile. And we need to really unpack that and heal from that if we're going to be able to get anywhere productive. But in addition to that, we need to ask ourselves, what makes a state Jewish? How does a nation state in the 21st century express the identity and values of the people of Israel? I'll just give a small example, or maybe it's not so small. This is a Shemitah year in Israel, right? We're in the sabbatical year. And in the Shemitah year, we get into all sorts of discussions over what produce we buy and what produce we'll eat. But Shemitah is not just about produce. Shemitah also has a very strong socioeconomic component that's completely ignored. We live in a country, or Israel is a country, where the majority of the population, finishes the month in minus. The bank account is in the red. Maybe once in every 7 years, we should wipe out that minus, and actually relieve people's debts. Maybe that would be a real expression of a Jewish state. Or will banks charge interest? Or will we sell weapons to human rights violators? I mean, these are all real questions about our values and our identity as expressed through a nation state. And I think part of the problem we've had up till now is when people think of Jewish state in this way, they're kind of thinking about like a Jewish Iran, where individuals are coerced by the state into halachic observance. And I don't think that was ever the vision. I don't think that was ever the point. I think, for example, I think for a nation state to be Shomer Shabbat, the question of Shemitah's socioeconomic ramifications might actually be more central than what every individual Jew does in his home every 7 days.
Meaning, but Reb David, you clearly are interested.
Rabbi Yehuda.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry,
Rabbi,
no problem.
Reb David, I just talked to a friend of mine, David. Rabbi Yehuda, you're clearly interested, and I'm not saying I disagree. I am an Orthodox rabbi, so I'm also interested in the Jewish state acting Jewishly and following halacha. But that means that decisions will be made for people based on the Bible, the Torah, right, and not necessarily, democratic vote of what the majority of the country wants to be governed by necessarily.
Well, I'm not sure that's true either.
And I want to get back. And I want to get back to the. I want to get back to the one-state solution. But let's.
Well, that's relevant. Meaning, this question is relevant because the more confidence we have in the Jewishness of our state, the less we're threatened by non-Jews being there,
Mm-hmm.
demographically even.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, I said before that our state is too Jewish for the Palestinians and not Jewish enough for the Haredim, because the Jewish character of our state is very shallow but very hard right now, very othering. I would like to see the Jewish character of our state be very deep yet very soft. So anybody with a Jewish education would see the Jewishness in almost every policy and institution, including how we express ourselves democratically. I think we also have to define what a democratic state means, because we haven't been. And I think that any non-Jew, or even Jews with less of a Jewish education, should barely notice that the state is Jewish, should just kind of see it as a well-functioning, just society where they have full inclusion and equality.
And how does let's if you don't mind me jumping in, because you use those words deep and soft. In other words, you want a deeper, want a deeper Jewish state, which represents authentic Jewish values and not just paying lip service, but actually following them. And at the same time, you want it done in a way that's going to work for Palestinians. So how does that work exactly?
Right. Well, in my experience, again, there are no Palestinians on the program now, so I can only really speak to my experiences engaging with them. So in my experience, what Palestinians really want, or what they see as a just solution, is a democratic one state where everyone is equal. Right? That's my experience of Palestinians. And I can agree with that. But I think that what prevents many Israelis from being able to get on board with that is a fear of losing the Jewish state,
right?
And whatever that means to them. So I think that if we can take the time as a society to really define what makes a state Jewish on a deep level, I'm not talking about the skin of the state. I'm talking about the organs and the skeleton of the state. And I think
the depth.
Right. Like for example, you mentioned democracy before. I am a supporter of participatory democracy, which I think is far more democratic than representative democracy, meaning, and we have models for this in our Torah and in our history, like the captains of 10, captains of hundreds, captains of thousands model. I think that for me, the way I would define democracy would be a system that empowers people to influence the structures they live under, as long as I am able to influence the structures I live under peacefully. I would experience myself having democratic rights. I think that's much more important to me than being able to vote in a popularity contest every 4 years. And I think most Palestinians feel the same way. And I think most people would feel the same way if given that option. And so I think that, shifting from a representative, democracy built around a British parliamentary model to a participatory democracy would both be in strengthening the state's Jewish character and democratic character.
And if you mentioned before that the Palestinians with whom you've discussed and had these conversations, they really want equality. They want a democratic country where they will feel as equal as any Jew.
Right.
So how do you have such a place and not compromise the Jewishness? How are we getting our Palestinian neighbors to somehow buy in to our Jewish value system?
So that comes down to the question that we have to ask ourselves: what is the ideal role of a non-Jew in a Jewish society? Historically, part of the problem, and this is, the lack of the post-colonial conversation. In exile, there are two types of people. There are Jews and Gentiles, and in most cases, we experience the Gentiles as the enemy, as the oppressor. And that has very much animated a lot of Israeli policies and a lot of Israeli positions. I'm not saying Palestinians are blameless. I'm not saying that they haven't contributed to this conflict. They have. But we have the upper hand, so I think building trust will really require us to make the first moves, and moving forward will really require us to make moves because we have the power. The power dynamics clearly favor us. Not only does that mean we make the first moves towards building trust, I think we get to call the shots to a certain extent at the beginning of the process, and that's also important. But I think that we have to ask ourselves, what does a ger toshav look like in the 21st century? Because when we've had power in history,
Just explain that for our listeners, what a ger toshav is.
what is the right of a non-Jewish resident of the land of Israel under Jewish sovereignty? Like, what does that really look like in its ideal form? And I'll just give you one example. You know, I meet plenty of women all the time named Yael, right? I don't know if you've met women named Yael. I'm sure you have. But Yael was a non-Jewish woman 3,000 years ago who lived in our country, was part of a population that was not Hebrew, but was allied to us, and became a hero of our history, became a hero of Jewish history, to the point that 3,000 years later, we're still naming our daughters Yael, meaning there is a dignified place for a non-Jew in a Jewish society, but we haven't figured out what that looks like because we're still dealing with this like Jew-Gentile kind of dichotomy from the exile. And I think we need to realize.
So what would it look like if we can dispense with the Jew-Gentile divide, which, by the way, I think is very accurate. Unfortunately, I think even in our very kind of in America where we feel so accepted and loved, I still think that outlook prevails. But so what would it look like? What kind of site are Palestinians living in this Jewish state, inspired by authentic Jewish values? They can vote. And
as much as we can. Again, I spoke about shifting to a participatory democracy. So I don't want to vote. Meaning I'm talking about getting together every week with my neighbors and discussing everything from road safety and education to foreign affairs and defense, and sending one representative to a larger meeting, et cetera, to be able to directly influence the policies of the country on a weekly basis, and to be able to recall my representative if he doesn't do what we had decided he should do in parliament or in the next group. And I would, of course, advocate for Palestinians to have that same democratic access. But I don't think just, letting the politicians do what they want for 4 years and then going and voting is real democratic power on any level.
And how would you, thank you, and how would you deal with the current aspiration of Palestinians for their own country, their own separate independent state? How do you tell 3 million Palestinians that, listen, you happen to be in Israel, we're running the show, we're going to create something new and different, so you won't feel outside, you'll feel a part of it, but you got to give up on your aspirations of having your own independence and your own sovereignty?
Well, it hasn't been my experience that the nation state is really a core aspiration of any Palestinians. I think they were told in the 1990s that they will achieve what is important to them through the vehicle of a European-style nation state. But I don't think that's really as important to them, in my experience, as living as an equal, included member of the society that exists. And of course, we have to address refugee issues. I mean, that's important to them as well, because that's very central to their story at this point. But I think the idea of a state with a flag and a national anthem, all that was kind of imposed on them by the Western powers during the Oslo years. And I think they realize, for the most part, in many ways, I would say that Palestinian politics are much more advanced than Israeli politics. And I think they figured out a lot quicker that this is a really bad way to go.
Yeah, but so let's say for a minute we could they lose that aspiration, or they realize it was imposed upon them, as you're suggesting.
Well, they have realized that. That's already happened. That happened years ago. They know that. They're past it. If you look at,
do you believe there are enough Palestinians who really would be okay without their own state? I'm saying down the road. We're talking.
First of all,
haven't. You've done much more than I have. So I don't know. I'm asking sincerely. You've spoken with Palestinians.
So I think the assumption that Palestinians really want a nation state is really an assumption that is kind of transmitted to us through the media, especially Western media, but it's not really the Palestinian street. That hasn't been my experience, over the last 13 years. And that's good, because the fact that they're not interested in political sovereignty or not focused on that being the goal, meaning that's not something that they can't compromise on, that means there's much more room for reconciliation. Because I'll tell you the truth, if they insisted on having political sovereignty at our expense, at the expense of the Jewish people over part of the land of Israel, I wouldn't be done fighting. Meaning for me, there's no peace if the land of Israel isn't in Jewish hands.
And you don't think, I mean, and I really appreciate your honesty. You don't believe in a two-state solution. Why?
Well, what do you mean? But my people were, I would say not only me, I would say the majority of Jews living in the West Bank, we're not a homogenous group. A Jew from Efrat is very different from a Jew from Beit El. A Jew from Alon Shvut is not a Jew from Yitzhar. There's a lot of diversity among Jews living in the West Bank. But I think the ideological common denominator is that we're an ancient people from this land that was unjustly displaced against our will. We struggled for thousands of years to come back, and we did. I think it was even a miracle that we maintained our identity in exile for so many centuries. No other ancient people that was destroyed succeeded in even doing that. But in addition to maintaining our identity, we actually came back to the land we had been displaced from. We revived our language. We took sovereignty from the British. We actually fought the British in a 9-year urban guerrilla war and won. According to British documents, they left Palestine because of Jewish terrorism. That means we beat them. And now we experience the international community trying to displace us again through a two-state solution. So for us, it's more about resisting the partition of our land because it's unjust, because we struggled for so long and so hard to come back to our land. We're not going to let anybody displace us again. And I was very pleased to learn over the years that Palestinian aspirations, are actually not fundamentally at odds with ours. Meaning we are, again, before I grew up, I was born and raised in New York City. I don't know if you remember me. We were actually on a trip together about 21 years ago with Israelite.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But I was young. I was real young. Yeah,
David, Aaron, Benny Friedman, sure. And
so that
dear friends.
So that was they're teachers of mine, and that was really. I was probably 21. If you do remember, you'd probably remember me as a very zealous young activist. But I learned a lot over the years. My experience.
You've mellowed out a lot.
Maybe I might have mellowed out, or maybe my politics just expanded, or maybe Rabbi Aaron taught me enough Kabbalah that I just started to see the world, from a higher vantage point. And the truth is, it actually was something that Rabbi Aaron taught me that allowed me to really hold the Palestinian narrative in addition to the Jewish narrative, and not feel that they have to necessarily conflict. Not that I'm sure he applies it that way, but I applied. It's actually teaching of Rav Kook in Mamar Dat Elokim, if you're interested. But the idea is basically that that at this point. We've fought so hard to come back to our land. We're not willing to compromise on it. But I've learned over the years that the Palestinian story is true and is painful, and acknowledging that pain, I think, is a big step in and of itself. I think most Jews, pro-Israel Jews, most Israelis, regardless of who they vote for, have a hard time really confronting the Palestinian story, and they have a hard time confronting our story. I would say one of the major obstacles to reconciliation right now is the principled resistance on both sides to really engaging with the story and identity and narrative of the other. We're afraid of it.
So here's the thing. This is very similar to Rudy, our good friend Rudy Rockman's outlook, who I just saw at the Israeli Day Parade yesterday. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think it's very refreshing, listening to each other's stories, acknowledging the pain on both sides. These are things that have not been done properly. And I agree. The question is, again, how do you, and I'm sorry to keep pressing because I'm struggling with this. I've always been a two-state solution just because I'm a pragmatist. Okay. And it's not that I want to see Israel split up, but I want to see I want to see Jews having their own country in Israel. Even if it can't be the whole place, it can be a big part of it. And I want to see peace. I want to see peace between Jews and Arabs. So it seems on the surface, the only way to do that is to give each, like what the United Nations tried back in 47, 48, to partition the land, give the Jews. Now, we were dancing in the streets of Tel Aviv the next day.
No, we weren't. We weren't. Meaning the students of Rav Kook were not, and those who fought the British were not. Those who collaborated with the British were.
Right, but the reason that there were Jews dancing in the streets is because just from a very pragmatic perspective, they're like, okay, we can't get the ideal situation, but we can. It's not Uganda, it's Israel, and we'll build something really beautiful here. And they had no idea what would happen 19 years later in 67, that we would triple the size of Israel through the Six-Day War, right? And that was thrust on us. That's not something that the Zionists classically would have. I'm just playing devil's advocate
Sure.
for the two-state solution, which makes a lot of logical sense, because it seems, it hasn't worked, obviously, but it seems like it would give the Palestinians what they want, the Jews what they want, and we can live b'shalom b'shalva separately, and not, what you're advocating. And I'm not talking about the morality or the ideology. I'm talking about practically. How do you get all of these Palestinians to sort of buy in? Now, you're saying that you started answering it by saying that by getting by changing the nature of the Jewish state, we go from a parliamentary democracy to what was the word you used?
A direct democracy, participatory democracy.
A participatory democracy where we could have greater influence on the leaders. I'm still missing how, A, you get the Palestinians to agree to this, and B, once they do agree to this, how do you keep the shalom? How do you keep the peace between these two significantly different groups living under one Jewish rule?
Well, you've said a lot, so I'm not sure what to respond to first. I'll tell you the truth.
Do it all.
Okay, I think anyone who really believes that a nation state in part of the country will address Palestinian grievances or aspirations has never really engaged with the Palestinian story. And I think that that's something two-staters really have to confront. I think what you see, for example, in organizations like J Street U, the moment they meet enough Palestinians is they're out the door. They're no longer J Streeters, because they realize that the two-state paradigm is no longer a real solution. You said maybe it can't work. I would say, or it hasn't worked, you said. I would say it can't work and it shouldn't work because it's wrong. It's unjust. It's unjust for us and it's unjust for them. Again, I represent maybe a stream of Jewish thought that would not have accepted the partition in 1947 and would see that as a great betrayal, and might have even thought that we should have continued to, go and take Judea and Samaria, after 48. That being said, I think today it's not. I think the questions you're asking, I hear the question, you keep asking the same question, and it's an important one within a certain ideological paradigm that I might not be functioning within. And I don't think most Israelis or Palestinians in the West Bank are really functioning in that paradigm either. I would say, first of all, if you want just, ideas, suggestions for how we can get them to trust us, I think that's important. Because for me, by the way, peace, when we're talking about a one-state reality, it only works if we are really connected to each other, if we really care about what's important to each other. Meaning, if we're just still scheming to defeat each other, but now we're living together in a democratic one-state solution that's deeply Jewish, it doesn't help. All this only works if we can fix our relationship. I have a colleague in Bethlehem, Sami Awad, who says that everybody wants to argue about the frame of the picture. What solution will work? A two-state solution, a one-state solution. Mordechai Kedar has an 8-state solution, but we need to talk about the picture itself. What is our relationship? And I think, look, I'm not a politician. I'm a very grassroots organizer and educator, and the work that I do is much less about the political solution that politicians will decide on, and much more about the relationships between Jews and Palestinians in the West Bank who live next to each other, and can actually not be enemies in each other's stories anymore, can actually change the roles we play in each other's stories. And I think that's what it comes down to. It comes down to us being able to get to a point where we have a decent enough relationship that we can live together. Of course, I want a one-state solution, but I know no solution is possible right now. Not 2 states, not 1 state, not the status quo, not 8 states, as long as the relationship is bad. The only thing we can 100%. Do is fix the relationship. And one thing I've never
the question is where do we want to go?
I want to go to 1 state. I want to go to 1 state, including Gaza. And quite frankly, I want Sinai back too.
Okay, no, I hear you. It's all these are all legitimate, and when you put it in those terms, the 2-state solution sounds awful because it doesn't seem to take into account what both sides really want.
Right.
It's a compromise on both sides.
It's worse than that. It's an imperialist solution. It's a solution of the British and French, or today the Americans, just drawing lines on maps and saying, you go there, without actually thinking about
I would respectfully do. I agree. Historically, it was imposed upon us by the European powers, but today, your typical two-state solution person just thinks, like I might, that I can't think of a better solution that could accommodate as much of the aspirations of these two peoples. How do you, I don't even know what the word is. Obviously, if we respect and love each other and we're caring about each other's.
But how do you get there?
Well, even if we do get there,
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi Yehuda, even if we do get there, how do you get Palestinians who do feel morally, even spiritually, from their perspective, whether it's a Muslim aspiration or not, that they should have their own governing rule and not be ruled over by their Jewish, who they like and are now convinced we have their best interest in mind.
Right. I think you're still thinking about this kind of nation state structure as, like, even the words you're using, like rule over as opposed to self-rule. I think, the future that I'm talking about is not one where a Palestinian is experiencing himself as ruled over. Right now he's ruled over. Right now he has a military bureaucracy controlling everything with it.
So spell that out a little. What does it look like? I want to see the dream a little more clearly. The dream is that the Palestinian living, let's not call it under Jewish rule. Maybe that isn't old. Good. How is this Palestinian participating in society? How is he or she living side by side with their Jewish, cousins, in peace? In your mind, how is this going?
Well, as very similar to the Drusim today, I would say. Meaning, I would say that an allied population that sees themselves as strong and dignified, and sees us as strong and dignified. Look, I'm not naive. I think, to have peace with anyone. When I grew up in New York City, I grew up with some rough people. I didn't grow up so much inside the Jewish community, and I have made peace with enemies. Even as a teenager, I made peace with enemies. And we were only able to make peace because we respected each other and maybe even feared each other enough to know we don't want beef. You have to be a little bit scary for people to want peace with you. Your peace has to have value, right? True. And that, by the way, that was my initial, you asked me before, what is the core opposition to a two-state solution on my part? I can obviously, speak about halakha, and I think it's completely, from my understanding of Torah, it's completely a halachic problem to talk about giving up any land. But even before that, I think what initially made me so opposed to this when I was maybe 20 years old and first kind of became politically active was the very fact that Israel would be trading land for peace communicates that Israel's peace is not valuable. Meaning, if we're the ones trading land for me, meaning if I offer you peace in exchange for your wallet or your shoes or your jacket or your computer, you'll only give those things to me because my peace is more valuable than your peace, right? If your peace was more valuable, then I'd be giving you my shoes and my wallet.
I don't know. I hear what you're saying.
Okay, but that was my initial. That was how I understood it at 20 years old, coming from the background I came from. But today I'm coming from the perspective that Am Yisrael has a mission in history, and we can only really fulfill our mission as a solid in our land, creating a society that can really inspire the rest of humanity. I think that includes the socioeconomic level, minority rights, that includes healthcare systems, that includes how our soldiers behave in war, how our politicians behave. I want Israel to be a real or legoyim. I want Israel to be
light. Means a light amongst the nations. Yeah.
Right, but really, I think that part of our problem and part of our colonization and part of how anti-Semitism functions is we've been on the side of the oppressed, of the oppressors, instead of the side of the oppressed. And I think that Israel didn't come back to life to be on the side of the oppressors. I think Israel needs to make a conscious decision to be on the side of the oppressed in the world today, including the Palestinians, even if we're if we've been playing a major role in their oppression. I think that's
Yeah.
something to do tshuva
Yeah.
for.
I mean,
But
I will. I will. I just want to jump right in.
Sure,
Just
sure.
something you said before. It's important for our
Mm,
listeners just to know. You know, in the beginning of Oslo, there was a debate within the Orthodox community about
mm,
the prospect of giving up land for peace. Now, most people today, because of everything that's happened, are pretty cynical about the whole thing. That meaning that that most people just in the Israeli camp, right and left, certainly in the more centrist to the right, but even in the left, there is a sense that we tried that, it doesn't really work. Um, again, being practical, Rav Soloveitchik was of the belief that it was permissible to give up land for peace if it could be demonstrated that Jewish lives could be saved. He famously said that you can give up the Kotel if it'll save Jewish lives. The land of Israel is of paramount importance in halacha and hashkafa, but saving a Jewish life is more important. He never advocated it. He said you got to ask the experts if you think it'll be effective. That's the mitziyut of the shaila.
mm.
But whether it's permissible now, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was against that. The Rav Kookniks, for sure, Rav Kook was against it, and there's that divide. But there is another perspective on transferring land for peace. Again, I don't think it's so relevant anymore today because I think that to whatever degree that was engaged in did not prove terribly fruitful. Although with Jordan and with Egypt, within Egypt, although they're called peace treaties, they are still treaties that have held out. And that's different than the Palestinians, which is a group living within Israel as opposed to, independent sovereign countries. So I just wanted to mention that. And that's one of the reasons why some people think that if you have a partner for peace, and you could sit down and negotiate and engage in some kind of that, maybe something positive could come out of it. I think it's time for a new paradigm. I'm open to the one state solution. I just want to know what that looks like. You say the Druze, that would be great. Druze seem to be an amazing population within Israel. They fight for the country. They have their own separate culture. How do you get, I mean, even if we were able to really hear each other, like you're saying, can we get the Palestinians to where the Druze are today? I mean, do you believe that? If you do that, I want to hear that because
I do believe it. I think that I didn't believe it until I started actually engaging with Palestinians in a very real way. And I don't just mean a couple tokens here or there. I'm not talking about the Palestinians who make their money on like pro-Israel circuits. I'm talking about, people who've been in prison for political violence. I'm talking about clan leaders in Hebron. I'm talking about Marxist revolutionaries in the Ramallah area. I'm talking about people who are really, living the Palestinian struggle. And from their perspective, again, we have to understand the Jewish people are unique in history. You could look at Zionism and say this is an indigenous people's liberation movement. You could also look at Zionism and say this is a colonial project coming from Europe. Both have facts supporting them. Both arguments have real facts supporting them because we're unique in history. There's no other example of an ancient people that was broken and came back to life 2,000 years later using, I think one of the things we have to acknowledge about Zionism is it utilized not only European concepts of nationalism, but also colonialism as a methodology. We have to be able to understand that Palestinians who don't know Jewish identity and who have today a psychological block to really understanding Jewish identity, all they saw were humans coming from Europe doing colonialism, using colonialist methodology. And so I think we have to clarify for them who we are. I think we have to also educate ourselves to who they are. I don't see, whether we want to win or make peace, I don't see any value in engaging them as a fantasy antagonist. I think we have to understand them as they understand themselves, and they would be wise to do the same in reverse. And in terms of the steps, because I think what you're really asking is like, what are the steps? Like, what can you do to make Palestinians experience you differently?
And by the way, if you don't mind
Mm.
commenting, Rabbi Yehuda, what do you think we can do? Jews living in New York City, Jews living in Israel, because even if we don't subscribe to your ultimate goal of, let's say, a one step, I love the way you talk. I love the way Rudy looks at another human being in the eye and acknowledges the pain that they're going through and has a real conversation. I think only good could come from that, as far as I'm concerned. So if you can throw into your answer here what you think our listeners could do,
Mm. Okay.
to engage, because there are Palestinians living in New York
Right.
City, and
Well,
whenever there's a
yes.
flare up in the Gaza Strip,
Mm.
there's we got a big problem. So it'd be good if we could do something here too.
Right. So the first thing I would advise Jews living in the diaspora to do is to really go to visionmovement.org and sign up for the Atid online leadership program, which
Hmm.
where we do three things. It's a free program. We have one starting next week, and it really aspires to do three things. Number one, apply post-colonial tools to Jewish identity and Jewish history in a way that's never really been done before. I think that's really exciting and really crucial. The second thing is to try and understand the Palestinian experience from their perspective, to really understand Palestinians, from the lens of Palestinians. And the third is to learn to communicate Israel's story to audiences who are usually pretty hostile to Israel. And to just understand how to share because our story is very unique. Our story doesn't fit into the boxes of what people are used to because
Correct. Yeah.
we are such a unique people. And I think
Yeah.
telling our story, sharing that story, whether it's with people in Black Lives Matter, whether it's people in the BDS movement, with the audiences that I think are worth engaging with are really those who are trying to change the world. And I think those people are, for the most part, hostile to Israel today. People in this country, in the United States, and I'm still in New York for a couple hours, but so those in the United States, those people trying to actually achieve political and social change to make the world better, hate Israel. That's our reality right now. And part of that might be our behavior a little bit. Part of it is also we don't know how to tell our story.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so part of what the Atid program does is it
It's great.
teaches young Jews to tell our story in a way that people could hear and not feel like they're throwing Palestinians under the bus, meaning to fully engage with the Jewish story in all of its fullness, and with the things we say in the Amidah 3 times a day, and with the things that Chazal, with our sages and our prophets, wanted to see in the world, without feeling like now they're betraying Palestinians.
And how do you sign up for this? You go to vision.org, and it's an
No,
online
it's
course, or
Vision
it's in
Movement,
person? I'm sorry.
visionmovement.org.
Okay,
We
Vision
have a,
Movement. Mhm.
yeah, if you go down to programs, you'll see there's a live version and an online version. The live
Mhm.
version is really for gap year students in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
And the online version, which we started at the beginning of COVID and realized there was such a thirst for this, is really available to Jews between the ages of 19 and 36 all over the world. And the idea of the program is to create leadership, to create not students of Herzl, but the next Herzl, meaning those who are able to really identify the objectives of Jewish history now. And I think it's crucial that those people, even if they don't agree with me, that reconciliation with the Palestinians is an important goal for the Jewish people right now, they should at least know the Palestinian story fully and deeply. Uh,
100%. By the way, if you want to host any of that at MJE, it would be a great honor,
sure, we'd love to.
because our population of 20s and 30s
Mhm.
are excited about Israel. We bring groups every summer, and they want to do something, and they want to be
Mhm.
part of something which is new and different and positive.
Mhm.
Even if, and that's why I want everyone listening to this to know that, Rabbi Yehuda and I have been maybe discussing, maybe even arguing a little, two-state, one-state. Honestly, taking a course like this, I don't think you have to decide between the two. I think the greater we engage the Palestinian people and understand their situation and learn tools to articulate. I mean, so many young people, Jews, on college campus, we're getting clobbered on college campus because we do not know how to articulate our story. We do not know how to, we're being basically called upon to justify our existence as this colonial power in our ancient homeland. And most American Jews are ill-equipped to do this. I'm assuming that this course can help to some degree with that.
Sure,
Yeah.
that's one of the major focuses. And again, there's no obligation to subscribe to my politics at the end of the course. Meaning, the point is to create leadership, and leadership means independent
Yeah.
thinkers, those who can see themselves as thought leaders of a new
Yeah.
Jewish liberation movement. And again, I urge people to do that. But once a person is able to engage with Palestinians in a productive way, meaning I don't mean, just arguing. Like yesterday, I walked by the parade. I'm sure you were there. You said you were there. And I happened to be on 59th Street, and I saw the counter protest. And I thought to myself, maybe I'll go speak to them, because, I'm usually pretty good at speaking to Palestinians and their supporters. But then I don't think it's the right context for a real open conversation, first of all. But second of all, I'm sure there are many people who marched in the parade yesterday. I'm sure there are many people who just want to go fight them. But I'm sure there are also many people, maybe even more people, who want to engage with them and hear them and explain to them what our story really is. And unfortunately, I think most Jews, most pro-Israel Jews living in the diaspora, are just not really equipped to have those conversations for various reasons.
And we're not. And I'll tell you something. The last time Rudy spoke at MG, which was just a few months ago, a Palestinian young man, Palestinian descent, came, and it started a little rough. But Rudy is very well equipped to. And by the end of the night, there was like a real conversation going. We took each other's information, and there was, it starts with respect. And I just think we need more of that. And I think we also need more knowledge. And it doesn't, what I like about your message, Rabbi Yehuda, is that it doesn't need to come at the expense of being proud of who you are and demonstrating your authentic belief in Torah and mitzvot. That's what's bothered me so much about the conversation. It's always like the more we cover up who we are and the more we compromise and put aside our Judaism, the better we'll get along with. I mean, that's been a losing proposition for centuries.
The opposite is true. Like I think, especially with Palestinians, the opposite is true. I think that that's why I was so disappointed in Bezalel Smotrich for not sitting together with Mansour Abbas. Meaning the government Israel has now is really the result of a principled refusal on the part of the leader of the National Religious Party not to sit with the Muslim party. Had he done that, I think we could have really created different kinds of relationships. In many ways, I think that those Jews who are really deeply connected to Torah, deeply connected to our land, deeply connected to our people's story, need to steal the Palestinians away from those Israelis who are just trying to make the state of Israel an outpost of Western civilization, like a Rhodesia.
Now, are you proud? I have a relationship with Michael Oren. I consider him a great Jewish leader. I don't agree with everything he says and does, but he spoke to our group a few years ago at the Knesset, and he was very proud of the fact that the Knesset, I don't even know if you're aware of this, I certainly wasn't, that the Knesset has a mosque for the 8 members of Israeli parliament that are Muslim, so that they could come and pray. Now, that's not necessarily the eschatological vision of our prophets of the Torah. Okay. On the other hand, it's kind of something which a little goes along the lines of what you were saying before about creating a country that Palestinians don't feel they've denied and so compromised away their own values because they have mosques to pray in. I don't know.
Right. I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. In my experience, most Palestinians aren't really driven by ideological Islam. That's not my experience. I know that's kind of the depiction in pro-Israel spaces of Palestinians. And it's cool that they have a mosque in the Knesset. I obviously have no problem with that. But I would like one thing that I think would be really productive if the government of Israel wanted to do something very small, in not even as a step, as a precursor to a meaningful step. I would suggest Israel start paying Palestinian civil servants. Right now we don't. The Palestinian Authority does, like bus drivers in Bethlehem or teachers in Jenin. Like we should start paying, because it's our country again. We're responsible. We should pay Palestinian civil servants the same salary we pay Israelis in that same job, which is roughly 4 times what they're making now. Meaning right now, an Israeli bus driver, an Israeli police officer, an Israeli hospital worker is making roughly 4 times what their Palestinian counterpart is making under the Palestinian Authority. What gives the Palestinian Authority so much power is the fact that so much of the Palestinian economy are civil servants. I think if Israel were to start unilaterally just paying civil servant salaries in the PA, alongside their PA check, meaning they would get an Israeli check and a PA check. One would be 25% of the other. And after 6 months of this, and by the way, small steps like that, I think, again, it's a precursor.
Yeah,
It's not the
yeah.
game changer. But I think we need to think about how they experience us in the story they're living in and how we could change that for the better. And I think that would at least whet the appetite on the other side. I think that would maybe create a lot of confusion on the other side. But ultimately, I think we're going to need to focus on the real structures that they experience as oppressive. And it means we have to confront some of our past. We have to really acknowledge that Zionism, even though it succeeded in bringing us back to life and bringing us back to our land, and all that is just because it's something we've been struggling to do for thousands of years. There were many Jewish liberation movements before Zionism. They just all failed, so we don't talk about them. But Zionism succeeded. But we also have to address that Zionism had flaws and used a lot of colonial methodology, and the state of Israel has a lot of colonialist structures today that need to be dismantled. But for us to be able to do that, we need to feel safe. So there's a lot of chicken egg here, but I think the real we can't move forward without real difficult conversations, and that's really at the end of the day what we're calling on.
Would you? I know you're against the current structure and therefore maybe cynical or hesitant to participate in it, but would you ever run for office? Would you ever try to develop a party within the Knesset?
I worked in party politics for a long time. I worked for 3 members of Knesset, people who I like very much and have tremendous respect for, but I acknowledge that just working for them, I saw firsthand how dirty the Knesset is. Unfortunately, the political culture of Israel today, I don't know if it was always like this, but the political culture of Israel today is a very dirty political culture. And I think I think just going into that system isn't enough. I think we need to really try to, I don't think it's a system that can be reformed from the inside at this point. I think that people need to really demand change, and there might need to be...
You don't want to clean up the swamp like President Trump used that language.
I don't know. I think that we have really... I think, first of all, I'm a teacher. I'm not a politician. But that's one thing I learned about myself at a certain point, that I'm really an educator more than anything else. I love education. I love teaching. That's really where I experience myself as a chelek elokam mimal. That's really where I experience myself as a unique spark of Hashem acting in this world as a teacher. I wouldn't want to give that up. I'm be more than happy for my students, including Rudy, to go to Knesset and create a party, and I'd be happy to help them and advise them, assuming they do it right and nobody sells out along the way. So, but the Knesset right now is unfortunately a very problematic political culture. Now, also, part of it is that it doesn't fit us, meaning we're still basically the Lehi beat the British left, and then the Zionists came and put a Jewish flag over a British colonial system. And it doesn't really fit our identity. India has the same problem, by the way. They have tremendous political instability in India because they're still functioning with a British colonial system that doesn't really fit their culture. So I think that I think the first step for us really moving forward on our side, and I hate to say Palestinians have to wait for this because they've been told already for decades that they have to wait for us to get our act together on our side. But the truth is, we're not going to be ready to engage them properly until we undergo a real post-colonial process. We need to go through a real healing process because unfortunately, and it's not easy to say, I don't think the majority of Israeli society is ready for real reconciliation. I just don't think we're there yet. I'd like to get there. I don't think it's our fault. I think we have tremendous trauma.
We're certainly not going to be able to get anywhere with the current Palestinian leadership or people if we don't talk to each other more. And things are broken down so badly. And the reason I'm interested in what you have to say, and Rudy, is because you guys seem to be the only ones really interested in talking. Now, I'm not saying that Israeli politicians don't want to, but to really listen to the other side and to try to come up. I have to tell you, I'm still struggling with how this thing would look and would unfold and how you could really have, but I hear it, and I hear the problems with the 2-state solution, obviously. And I wish you tremendous mazel and bracha. Just know that I'm not telling you what to do, and I'm also a teacher, and that's where I find my sipuk nefesh, also my satisfaction of the soul. But you want to make a difference. I'm not going into politics, but you have spent a lot of time talking to Palestinians. You have a unique perspective on what you think could accommodate both groups.
Mhm.
I don't think most Israeli politicians have spent a lot of time talking to their Palestinian counterparts, maybe leaders. But I agree with what you said before. The leaders are, I mean, I don't know if you said this, but the leaders don't, I don't think there's such a gap between the leadership and the actual people on the street.
Sure.
Which is why you can have leaders sitting down with Israelis and you can still have, anti-Semitism in textbooks being taught still in Palestinian schools, and both happening at the same time.
People are being very pragmatic, as you said.
Right.
Especially Mahmoud Abbas.
Right.
But look, I'm optimistic for the future. I think we're headed in a good direction. I think, I'm not a student of Rav Soloveitchik, as you've probably realized already. I'm a student of Rav Kook. I'm very much coming into this as a student of not only Rav Kook, the Maharal of Prague, the Ramchal, the Gaon of Vilna, the Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi, the Ramban, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. I'm coming into this with a specific understanding of Jewish history, Jewish purpose in history, a Jewish mission that we have the ability to actually achieve now more than ever before.
Well, don't misunderstand the Rav Soloveitchik. He left the Aguda over this issue and joined the Mizrahi group because he saw the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, and he saw what happened in Milchemet HaShechror as Yad Hashem. If you study his work, he had a particular machloket with the Rav Kookniks over the land for peace, which is more of a specific halachic issue. I don't think, he didn't speak about Zionism in messianic terms like Rav Kook did,
right?
But he definitely saw it as some expression of God's
so
hand.
I that's true, and I concede that. I guess where I guess in my experience having this conversation with people from the Rav Soloveitchik world, and I appreciate a lot of things about that world. I'm not trying to attack that world, chas v'shalom, but I think the problem that I've identified that I think is not just the Rav Soloveitchik problem, I think it's a Haredi problem too, is the context. When Jewish education, in my opinion, should really begin with what is the mission of the Jewish people in history. And I've often had this, when we would debate issues like land for peace, when I've had that disagreement with students of Rav Soloveitchik or students of Rav Lichtenstein, and a couple times I would try this experiment saying, well, let me ask you a question. What's the mission of the Jewish people in history? And this is such a central idea in not only in Rav Kook's Torah, but really in all of the Gedolim I mentioned over the centuries. And I would get blank stares. It's just so peripheral to the core curriculum of what people are taught in so much of the Jewish education that exists right now, and I'd get answers like, to do mitzvot, like to be religious, like that's the goal of Jewish history. And I don't think that's true. I know that's not true because I've seen the Mikorot.
I mean, this is for another podcast. Actually, this would be really great because I think there's a historical purpose and mission to the Jewish people, and there's a metaphysical, spiritual mission to the Jewish people. Keeping mitzvot and bringing Hashem. You quoted the Tanya before, Nefesh Elokit. That is our goal and our purpose in this world, to bring God where God isn't. But
that's true.
If you were to talk about a particular historical,
right,
I think that's a different question. I think the Rav Aaron Lichtenstein of Soloveitchik would have an answer to that too. But
I would assume they would. But it certainly wasn't at the center of the yeshiva education that was being given. Whereas in the Rav Kook world, that is the center.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate distinction. Yeah,
and of course, where the state of Israel fits in.
Right. And listen, the difference is also, and this is an interesting thing that, I'm like a poster child for YU, Yeshiva University. My father went there. I went there with my kids. But when we go for our gap year in Israel, our influences are more the Rav Kookniks, not the Rav Soloveitchiks, because in Israel, the predominant, I think, hashkafa or outlook, ideological outlook on Israel, religious Zionism, is more influenced by Rav Kook, because he was in Israel. The Rav stayed in the United States, in the diaspora. So even though YU's put out thousands of mismachim over the years, I think the hashkafa within the modern Orthodox community, we say Rishit Smichat Gulatenu. That's not a Rav Soloveitchik idea.
No.
The beginning, no, that's a Rav Kook idea. That's a messianic. I just taught a whole thing on this, and that's a more messianic kind of thing, and invoking Bar Kochva and Rabbi Akiva, thinking he was the Mashiach and all that. That's very much aligned in all that. I hear that. But it's interesting. You should just know that I think most of the modern Orthodox, next generation have a little more of the Israeli Rav Kook view than the Rav, just because that's where we're getting that dose from in our gap years. And listen, most of my chaver made aliyah. Most of my friends who I went to Y with live in Israel. Bezrat Hashem will all be there. But it's I'm just saying it's an interesting sociological.
Right. We should.
Yeah.
At some point, we should sit down and have a proper conversation. Maybe not on the podcast. And next time you bring a group to Israel, feel free to come visit us on our mountain, or we could even set up a panel with some Palestinian and Jewish activists talking to your group.
That would be great. And I meant that offer about MGE hosting. One of the it's a conference, right? I mean,
we do all sorts of things. The core we can do events in New York.
I just want to promote anything that gets people to sit down and talk to each other, and you guys are doing that. So, kol hakavod to you, and kol hakavod to just building the land and the Jewish presence in Israel, which you've dedicated your life to. So I thank you for that, and I thank you for your time. You're articulate and passionate, and I really respect everything you're doing. So please,
likewise.
Let's continue this conversation. And thank you so much for your time. I wish you a safe trip back to home to Israel.
Yeah.
And Bezrat Hashem, you should just be matzliach, continue your incredible work.
Amen. Gam lecha. Also you.